Greeks to know that they were plotting insurrection. So they would cover up the sand, and then they'd take out their little dreidels, and they'd start playing this gambling game, pretending like they were shiftless, gamblers and nothing to worry about. Sort of like the Keystone Cops, right? The Greek soldiers were Keystone Cops that wouldn't know what they were doing. That is an interesting story, but it has nothing to do with the dreidel, at least not originally. So the real story of the dreidel is this, and I hate to blow everybody's imagination, but this is the story if you haven't heard it before. It turns out that this particular kind of gambling was very popular all over Europe in the Middle Ages. England was playing it, France was playing it, Germany was playing it, Italy was playing it, and in every country, the letters that were on the four sides of the top were different depending on what language they spoke. Because the four letters were supposed to stand for taking all of the pot, taking half of the pot, doing nothing, or putting something into the pot. So first of all, the way you play this game, if you haven't played the dreidel game before, is everybody gets in a circle, everybody puts in a coin or a piece of candy or a nut or something. You put something into the pot, and then you spin the dreidel and you see what it falls on. If it falls on the gimel, then that stands for ganz, all. You take all of the pot. And so that person, the person who spun the dreidel, cleans out the pot, everybody puts in a new coin, and he passes the dreidel either to the right or the left. I don't know whether it goes clockwise or counterclockwise. Doesn't really matter. Anyway, so the next person would spin the dreidel, and if it landed on a hay, that stands for halb, half. So that person who spun the dreidel would take half of what's in the pot. Then everybody puts in another coin or another nut or another piece of candy, and the dreidel is passed to the next person who spins it. And if it lands on a nun, that stands for nine, nothing. So then nothing happens. The pot just stays there. Everybody puts in another coin or another nut or a piece of candy, whatever. The dreidel goes to the next person who spins it. And if it lands on a shin, that meant shtel. That would mean you have to put in another one. So the person who spun the dreidel had to put in another coin, and then everybody puts in another coin, and the dreidel goes to the next person. And that's how the gambling game was played. So depending on what country you were in, the letters would represent all, half, nothing, or put in. Of course, the Jews in Germany used the German form of the lettering, but because Yiddish is, of course, mostly German with a little Hebrew, and it's spelled in Hebrew letters. So they took the German words, right, ganz, which means all, and they used a gimel to represent that. Halb, they used a hay, and shin would be shtel, to put in, and so on. So that's how they did the dreidel game, and you would play the dreidel game depending on what country you were in. You would play the dreidel game. So then they associated the letters with a mnemonic device. Nun, gimel, hey, and shin would stand for nes gadol haya sham, right? So a great miracle happened there. And as a consequence of making that, associating the letters with Hebrew words, nes gadol haya sham, when the game ended up coming to Israel after the state of Israel was created, they changed the letter shin to a letter pei. This is an Israeli dreidel, right? So in the Israeli dreidel, it's nun, gimel, hey, pei. Why? Because then it says nes gadol haya po, which means a great miracle happened here, right? Because the miracle happened in the land of Israel. In any case, that's all well and good. The real reason that we play the dreidel game, though, is because Jews are not supposed to gamble. I hate to say this. I know that Jews were involved in creating Las Vegas, and certainly there's a lot of Jews in the gambling business, and a lot of Jews like to go gambling. But in halakha, in Jewish law, you're not supposed to gamble because you're basically asking God. It's as if you were asking God to work a miracle for you so that you should win, and you're not supposed to ask favors for such trivial matters as winning in a gambling game. So normally Jews were not supposed to gamble. But what happened was on Hanukkah time, the kids were home from school. Jewish schools, it's a holiday, they're home. And the mothers are trying to, because it was a patriarchal world, the women were the housewives. They were taking care of the house, trying to clean, cook, etc., take care of the kids. And while they're trying to clean and cook, the kids are making a lot of noise, they're getting into trouble, and she's having to referee between the kids. And it was a big mess. So the women wrote to the rabbis and asked, we know we're not supposed to gamble, but there is this popular gambling game going around Europe right now, and our kids are really interested in it. If we could just have them play that game and keep them occupied for a few hours while we clean the house, that would enable us to do our work. And if they're only playing for a few pennies or for pieces of candy or nuts, it's not like they're gambling a lot of money. So can't they do that? Maybe they could let them gamble for this particular purpose just on Hanukkah so we can get our work done. This is, of course, in the days before video games and before television. So how else do you occupy kids unless you have a game they can play? So the rabbis wrote back and said, yes, you can use this gambling game as a way to keep the kids occupied while you're working at home, only during the days of Hanukkah. And so this dreidel toy game became associated with the festival of Hanukkah. And then came Nes Gadol Hayasham. The letters came to sort of represent the holiday of Hanukkah. And so as Europe gradually moved away from dreidels, the tops with four sides, they found better gambling things, cards and dice and roulette wheels to play, more interesting gambling games. Nevertheless, this top got associated with Hanukkah, and so it stuck. And so even after everybody else stopped playing this game, Jews continued to play the dreidel game on Hanukkah because of its association. That's the story of the dreidel. Now let me tell you the story of the menorah and why I chose a tree. So as we know, when the Maccabees were finally able to recapture the temple, they took the statue, the idol of Zeus, the Greek god Zeus, out of the temple and destroyed it. And then they cleaned up the temple and refurbished it and sanctified it again for the worship of the one God. And what is the symbol of the temple? What is the primary symbol of the temple's service to God? Was the creation of that 7-branched lamp that stood in the temple. I'm going to show you a picture of it right now. Okay, that is the 7-branched lamp that stood in the temple. You'll see up here there were bowls. Before there were candles, we used olive oil. So these bowls would be filled with oil, olive oil. There'd be little wicks coming out of them, and they would burn all night. That 7-branched lamp represented God's presence in the temple. It represented God's presence among the Jews. It also, light symbolizes wisdom, knowledge, enlightenment, right? All those symbolisms. It also represents the Torah, right? The Torah is a light. And so it represents all these different things. And when it's lit in the temple, it has all those different meanings. So the first thing that the Maccabees did when they captured the temple was relight that 7-branched lamp. And that's why we call it the Festival of Lights, because that was the symbolic act that re-sanctified the temple for the worship of God. And therefore, we light lights on Hanukkah. Now, if you take a look at this, I'm going to share the screen again. If you take a look at this 7-branched lamp, you'll notice that it looks a lot like a stylized tree. It's the way a kindergartner would design a tree. Certainly I did when I was a kid, right? You have a trunk that's a straight up and down in the center and branches symmetrically coming out of either side, right? So these are called branches, right? Coming out of the trunk. And it's clearly supposed to be a stylized tree. It's also ornamented with almond blossoms, according to the Torah. And so it clearly is supposed to represent a tree. And of course, in that sense, it also represents the tree of life, perhaps in the Garden of Eden, and the Torah, because the Torah, we say, is Eitz Chaim Hi L'machazikim Ba. It's a tree of life for those who hold fast to it. So the original lamp in the temple was supposed to look like a tree, a stylized tree. And that's why when I saw this in our gift shop, I had to buy a tree-shaped menorah to remind us that that was the original idea of the lamp, that it was supposed to look like a tree. One last thing before we go. I know that we tell the story about how when they lit the lamp, there was only one jar of oil that was only going to last for one night, and then they'd have to find some more oil. They'd have to go out and harvest some more olives and press them and make olive oil to get more light. And it would take them 8 days, according to the story, to press enough olive oil to light the lamps for the rest of the time. But this one jar of oil would only burn for one night. They decided to light it anyway, and miraculously it lasted for 8 nights until they could get more olive oil. That's the story that we tell. It's the story that's told in the Talmud. However, the Talmud was written hundreds of years after the Maccabean revolt took place. And if you've been to Jerusalem, you know that the Temple Mount is bounded on the east side by the Kidron Valley. And on the other side of the Kidron Valley is another hill, and that hill is called the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is where the Garden of Gethsemane is. Gethsemane is the English name for Gat Shemen in Hebrew, which means oil press, because the Mount of Olives was full of olive trees. People would pick the olives, take it to the oil press, and have it pressed into olive oil. In other words, olive trees were right across the street from the temple. It wouldn't take much to harvest the olives and press the oil and get it to work. So not likely that that was the problem. And in any case, we know that from the second book of Maccabees, which was a book written by Jews roughly the time of the events of the Maccabean revolt, and the second book of Maccabees explains why the holiday lasts for 8 days. And it says that the Maccabees wanted in September to capture the Temple Mount from the Syrian Greeks. And they thought to themselves, if only we could capture the Temple Mount now, we can rededicate the temple on the festival of Sukkot, the Feast of Booths, in September. But unfortunately, they were not able to capture the temple until December, 3 months later. And so when they were able to capture the temple, they decided to celebrate Sukkot 3 months late anyway. And they called it the Feast of Booths in Kislev, or the Feast of Booths, we would say, in December. Why do they want to celebrate the Feast of Booths? Why were they so anxious to celebrate the Feast of Booths in the temple? Because the Maccabees were God-fearing people, and they read the Bible and they knew it backwards and forwards. And King Solomon, when he built the first temple, dedicated that temple on the festival of Sukkot. So the Maccabees wanted to rededicate the temple to the worship of God on the festival of Sukkot in September. They weren't able to do it. It took them until December to capture the temple and rededicate it. So they decided to celebrate the Feast of Booths in December. And as we know, Sukkot is a 7-day holiday, but tacked on at the end of Sukkot is Shmini Atzeret, the 8th day of assembly. Altogether, it makes an 8-day holiday. And that is the real reason that the Maccabees dedicated Hanukkah for 8 days. That's the real reason it's 8 days long. But the symbol of the lamp is nevertheless a crucial symbol for the holiday, because it did represent the return of God to the temple in Jerusalem, the return of God's presence in our midst, enlightenment, wisdom, knowledge, hope, and all those things that light represents. So lighting the menorah is indeed an important thing to do on Hanukkah. It's highly symbolic for our holiday. As Peter, Paul, and Mary sang their song, "Don't Let the Light Go Out." That's what's pretty amazing. The real miracle of Hanukkah is we Jews are still here over 2,000 years after it looked like we would be assimilated into Greek culture. But no, we fought back, we preserved our identity, we preserved our traditions, and we're still here today, long after the Greek Empire has disappeared. So with that, I wish you all a happy Hanukkah, And we have a few days left to celebrate. May you have hope and light.